Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today, I talked to my friend and outdoorsman, Noah Wishau. He's on the board of directors of the Wisconsin chapter of the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, a group that looks to preserve North America's outdoor heritage of hunting and fishing through public education and advocacy. I talked with Wishua about his concern over the spread of chronic wasting disease in the deer population, the public debate over climate change, and his desire to protect nature for future generations. Can you tell me about the first deer that you got?
Oh, the first deer that I got, I was when I was 12, and it was a nubby buck that came in. I had close encounters earlier in the fall, but it was like about this time, middle of October, and he'd come in, and I was sitting in a tree stand. I had heard deer over. I was sitting in a different tree stand the morning before, and had heard deer over by this other stand, so I went and sat that the next morning, and he came in, and I shot him. I'd like to say I made a great shot, and everything was textbook, but it wasn't. This was a bad shot. It was back a little bit, but I basically hit him in the spine, and it took a little bit to, I guess, finish him off. So it was kind of a traumatic experience, I guess. This would be the best way to put it. It wasn't as clean as I would have hoped it to be. I think if you ask my dad, he'd probably tell you he thought he lost. He thought he didn't know if I'd go hunting again, just the way it kind of all worked out. But
oh wow,
yeah, it was a tough one. But I think something people got to remember is, we do our best to be as ethical as possible, but in nature, nothing's ever perfect. So sometimes things don't work out the way that you hope, but you got to figure out what to do next. So that was my first deer.
So what made you come back? Why were you not deterred, I guess?
I think by that point, I'd been tagging along with my dad for, this was when I was 12. It was the first year I could legally hunt. But before that, I'd been tagging along with him for, 7, 8 years before that. So I think I just kind of understood that sometimes things like that happen. And it made me more cognizant, and it wasn't that I hadn't practiced enough or anything like that. It was just the excitement of the moment, and I basically jerked my arm because I was so excited about shooting, and it shot back from where I was aiming. You just realize, like I said, things don't always go perfect, but that doesn't mean you, I guess, stop.
Now, I know you're a big reader. You've read Leopold and other outdoor writers, and I'm curious if there's like a phrase or a piece of writing that often like echoes in your head when you think about the outdoors or your philosophy on conservation.
There's a quote from Jim Posowitz, who's a writer. He's actually born in Sheboygan, lives out in Montana now. But there's a quote where he talks about, I can't quote it verbatim, but the gist of it is basically the hunting tradition that we have now, it didn't just happen. It's due to works by people both big and small who have made sacrifices throughout, especially over the last 150 years or so, to make sure that it got to us. And it's not just ours now. We owe it to the future to continue moving it forward that way. So that's a lot less articulate than I think the way Jim wrote it, but that's pretty much the gist of it. Is we need to understand that we inherited this from great men and men that would, probably even their great-grandchildren don't know their names, but they all did something to make it get to where we are today. And we need to realize that we inherited that from them, and our children and grandchildren are going to inherit it from us. So we got to make sure that at worst we give it to them in the same condition that we received it.
Do you have a favorite outdoor spot in Wisconsin? Is there like a place that you could just I guess is your outdoor happy place?
Yeah, for us in fact, my dad's up there this weekend. We call it the Shack. And it's up kind of between Clintonville and New London, Manawa, kind of in that area. of the state, kind of northeastern, maybe about 45 minutes from outside of Appleton. And it's 80 acres, and that's our place where we go, and it's kind of, there's no electricity, no running water, and it's just quiet. So I think that would be it. I think Wisconsin, from basically north to south, east to west, there's thousands of places that are just like that. The shack, or our land up there, is, for me, that place, because, I have so many memories. The story I told about getting my first deer, that happened right there, by maybe 150 yards from the back door of our cabin. So all those memories, hunting with my grandpa, his cousin, my uncle, my dad, all of those things is what ties me to that. But, I'm sitting down in southeastern Wisconsin right now. Probably I could be in downtown Milwaukee in half an hour, and there's spots 10 minutes from where I'm at right now that could probably fill the void. So we're very fortunate to live in a state like this.
We'll talk a lot about chronic wasting disease, but just on a simple level, on a scale of like 1 to 10, like 10 being the most, like how concerned are you about chronic wasting disease among Wisconsin deer?
We were in Madison earlier this year talking to legislators about some of this stuff, and I don't know that I'm overstating it when I say that I think it's the conservation issue of our century right now. And it's not just in Wisconsin, it's nationwide. I think the last time I looked, there's 27 states that have positives, 3 or 4 Canadian provinces. This is a big deal. And I think people seem to be starting to wake up towards it, but I don't know that there's a lot of pushback from it. And that's due to some of the way things were handled early on when it was first discovered. But the modeling of this disease, there isn't a cure. It spreads out, and once it gets to, hits prevalence rates of about 20%, the studies show that there's a impact on deer populations. And once it gets much higher than that, it gets to a point where pretty much hunting isn't sustainable, let alone just keeping the deer around. So the problem with it is like most things, it's not just something that you can see real easy. So it's not mounds of dead deer laying all over the place like with other diseases like EHD or blue tongue that kills deer quick. The CWD takes about 18 months. It's always fatal, but really it stays on the landscape forever. I mean, it's just always there. So it's not something that goes away like blue tongue. A good hard frost will kill the midges that cause that disease. So then it has maybe a significant impact on a local population, but not overall. Whereas CWD the studies seem to show that it has a significant impact overall on the population.
So that sounds like a 10, I guess is what you're telling me.
I think it's a 10. I think people, I guess you asked me for a number. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, I think it's a 10. I think the hunting community needs to understand what we're facing here. And I think some are starting to, but there's a lot of pushback.
So just a second ago, we were talking about kind of the tradition of hunting a little bit. Hunting and fishing is generally just seen as like a very traditional activity, but the advancement of technology affects everything. It just does. Like, how do you see it changing because of technology over the next 20 years?
Well, throughout human history, I think of everything that we've done, I think you could argue that technology has affected hunting the most. I mean, we started probably started as scavengers, the way they figure it, and eventually we built, we got pointy sticks, and then we moved up to where we could throw those pointy sticks farther if we use an atlatl, up to now we got a bow, and then up to firearms all the way to present day. It's an interesting balance because over the last 130, 140 years, we've introduced something that's known as fair chase, which basically is just what it sounds like. We're going to, in an ethical way, give the animals as much of a chance as, I guess, as tradition dictates. Basically what that means is you don't run deer down with a Humvee with a machine gun on top of it and chase them around and shoot them that way. We have it in our ability as humans to severely impact our populations, but we don't. But you're always pushing the boundaries of what we had. The bows of today compared to the bows of my youth are night and day difference. And now really where this is coming into play is the introduction of the crossbows being allowed during the archery season. That's a whole can of worms that people will argue up and down, and you want to start a fight in a hunting community, bring that up, whether or not they should be allowed. And there you can go both ways. So it's interesting. I guess what I'm getting at is technology itself is interesting, because where does the limits meet what we consider fair chase? And that's a question that I think you battle with every single upgrade in technology. I think that's one issue. I think another issue is obviously social media. I think has had a big impact on a lot of hunting stuff. I mean, you can go on Facebook at any given time and you'll know what people are seeing in just about every corner of the state, because some of the Facebook groups, because they're on their phones and letting people know what's going on. You feel the pressure of not just 30 years ago when you shot a deer or shot a buck, it was maybe what's the rest of my hunting party going to think about this buck. Now it's, if I shoot that one and I post it on Facebook, am I going to get laughed at for, shooting a little 8-pointer instead of waiting for a great big 10-pointer to come through? I think these are all things that we as hunters are dealing with, and sometimes we're dealing with it well, and I don't know, sometimes we're probably not.
So it is hunting season. I guess I know hunting season is a little bit, it's different now. It's not what it was when we were younger, but it's a little bit more extended and wide open. But how's it setting up? What are your plans for the season? What are you thinking about?
Well, I've spent most of September shooting doves up at my grandpa's house, or getting out there as much as I could. Deer season kind of got put on hold. Like I said, I was in Wyoming the first week of October, and hunting antelope and mule deer out there. So then whitetail hunting back here kind of has been put on hold. I'm planning on getting out next weekend, and then I'll be going pretty regularly up through probably the holidays or so. So I don't know. It's hunting season in Wisconsin, so it always looks like a good time. So.
Can you talk a little bit about how it is different than like when you were growing up? It was, I guess, I mean, you know more than me, but it was a much more compact season, more defined, and now it's a little bit more extended. You can do different things during different periods. How has that changed over the years?
I think the big thing, like bow season and gun season, have always been fairly regular. With CWD and a couple of other things, there was some things where they kind of bounced around a little bit. But for the most part, it's always been, the second, third weekend in September through New Year's was bow season. And then there's a 9-day gun season during basically the week of Thanksgiving. Since we've grown up, they've added some things. There's a youth hunt that just took place last weekend, where basically kids under the age of 16 get to go out rifle hunting at the beginning of October. They go out with a mentor and are able to hunt earlier than we were traditionally do. Other than that, every year changes a little bit, but there's some hunts later on, like the holiday hunts some counties have as a form of population control when it comes to deer. But for the most part, I mean, the traditions are still there. It's still fairly similar to what we've always had.
What are the hot topics among sportsmen and women in Wisconsin right now? What are the kind of things that people are talking about at the shack? What are the hot topics?
Well, for, I guess, CWD, we touched on a little bit earlier, is a big topic. I think it's a hot topic. There's a lot of conspiracy theories when it comes to whether or not it's actually as important or as much of a danger as the scientists are putting it out to be. I think, like I said earlier, there's some things that happened early on after the discovery of CWD when we were in college, so 2001, 2002, that time period. Basically, the DNR, just like every state since then, okay, we got CWD, and then it was, what are we going to do and how are we going to take care of this? And I think the thought process originally was they thought it was limited to a small geographic area. So they thought, if we step on that match right there, the little bit of the spark around the Mount Horeb area, maybe we'll be able to put it out and it won't affect the rest of the state. And they called it the eradication zone, so people thought they were trying to kill every single deer. And and then the pictures started coming out of just piles of deer that have been shot during these seasons, and it kind of goes against what most hunters, how pretty much the hunting community views things. It's, you don't just pile up deer, you shoot your deer that you're going to take to eat, and that's how it's supposed to be. And this kind of ran counter to that. So there was a severe pushback to that, probably about 10 years ago or so. And since that time, the policy of the DNR had been just to monitor CWD and really not do anything about it. But what we ended up watching is the whole state catching on fire. Now we got, I don't know, if you look at a map, it's across the state, all over the place. There's only a handful of counties that aren't considered CWD affected, and it's nationwide. It seems like every time you read a article about another state getting their first positive, the leader of their DNR or similar agency stands up and says, well, we're not going to be Wisconsin. And I think that's an embarrassment for our state and I guess the leaders of the state who have allowed that to happen.
Do people just not do hunters just not trust the DNR? I know there's a lot of, give and take on that, but is that just generally where it's been? I mean, at the time and now, do people just not trust the DNR on this issue?
People don't trust the DNR on a whole lot of issues. And some of that might be rightfully so. But like on this issue in particular, it's I was just looking today, the DNR posted something about baiting bans, which have to do with CWD. And there's people talking about the fact that the DNR is having a baiting ban because they're just trying to make more money. And how can the DNR possibly make more money by not letting you bait? Like it only kind of tangentially makes sense. They just want to fight the DNR is just making it all up. But what they don't have an answer for is, okay, the Wisconsin DNR is behind all of this. Why is the Minnesota DNR and the Wyoming DNR and the Colorado DNR or Fish and Wildlife or whatever they call it at each of these places doing very much the same thing, saying pretty much the same things? And if you believe somehow it's a conspiracy nationwide, why is Alberta and Saskatchewan doing these things? Why did Norway eradicate a whole herd of reindeer a couple of years ago? Because they found a CWD positive. So if it's going to be a conspiracy, it's worldwide. And I just have trouble. I have a lot of trouble believing that it's a worldwide conspiracy against us. So because of that, I think it is the threat that, the scientists are saying. And when you read the studies, I'm not a scientist. I can read the studies and usually I have a fair understanding of what they're saying. The ones that say that it's a big deal are a lot more convincing than the ones that don't.
When you say it's a big deal, I mean, what is the worst case scenario that we're looking at?
The worst case scenario, absolute worst case scenario, maybe the extinction of deer. Just because of the way that these work, hopefully there's some hope that there may be some form of resistance to it, but even the resistance for different strains of DNA in deer it's a resistance. It's not an immunity. So there's some hope that could happen, but I think on a smaller level, I think it could be the end of deer hunting, not only in Wisconsin, but anywhere where this disease is. Before I talked about EHD, which is blue tongue, which is a disease that kind of is caused by midges or little bugs that basically cause this disease, and on a local level has severe impacts on populations. The big thing, people think that's a huge threat, and it is on a local level, but the big thing is they can see it. CWD, the way it works is I don't think by the end of my lifetime it'll have a big impact, but I think certainly by the end of my children's lifetime, and most definitely by my grandchildren's lifetime, it will. And it can. So that's why I think we need to step up efforts on it now.
So for people who don't know what chronic wasting disease is, I mean, could you paint a little picture? I know you're not a scientist, you're not a biologist or anything, but what is it?
Basically, it's the deer form of mad cow disease. Basically, there's these little proteins called prions that, for all intents and purposes, eat holes in the brain. In humans, it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob. For something that people would be familiar with, it's kind of similar to maybe like an Alzheimer's type situation where you just basically, it eats away at your brain and you become totally unaware of stuff. At the end stages, there's drooling and other stuff going on. Popular media refers to it as the zombie deer disease because they kind of become, or they don't really seem to know what's going on. And there's a big argument one of the major arguments against CWD being a big issue is hunters saying, well, how many deer have ever just died of CWD in the wild? And they think they're, I guess, real smart when they ask that. And my question is if you take anything and put it out in the wild and take away its, awareness, how long is it going to last? They don't tip over dead from the clinical stages of CWD. They get killed by predators, or they wander out in front of a car, or they get shot by hunters who maybe 3 weeks before they would have seen the hunter or not walked out in front of the car, but they lost the ability to have that cognitive function to stop themselves. That's pretty much in a nutshell what it is. It's kind of like a dementia or an Alzheimer's for deer. I'm sure scientists are, if any of them are listening, are cringing at that explanation, but that's basically these holes in the brain and causes that to happen.
Have you ever seen a deer that you suspected was affected in the wild?
I haven't. In Waupaca County, we had a positive, but it was on a game farm, which is a whole other issue. I haven't, but the problem is most of the time, by the time they reach a stage where to the naked eye, the clinical signs become visible. They're typically already dead. Like I said, a predator will have gotten them, or they'll have wandered out in front of a car or gotten shot or something like that. So just standing there looking at a deer and saying it's got CWD, very rarely is that going to happen, which is another reason that people think that it's not actually happening.
And what's the general advice that the state gives or people give as far as eating the meat of a deer that's suspected, and what are some of the requirements that have been put on hunters as far as testing in recent years?
Well, there is. I guess I'll take the first part of that question in terms of whether or not to eat it. The CDC says don't eat it. It's never made the jump to humans that we're aware of. Mad cow disease did do it, so they know that these diseases can jump the species barrier, which is concerning. But CWD has not made that jump that anybody's aware of. But the big thing that the scientists all say is has not is different than cannot. So you're always playing that game of, are you going to be the first one, which is scary. And honestly, you might end up being okay and you could eat CWD positive deer your whole life, and it might never have an effect on you. Or it might. You don't know. And that's a risk. Me personally, my wife is going, if we ever shoot a CWD positive deer, my wife would make me throw it out. I'd have trouble doing that, but I would do it. She got mad at me because told her, but she asked what happens if there's a positive. And I told her that her and my kids wouldn't eat it, but I don't know what I'd do. And she got pretty mad at me when I said that. So apparently now now I'm going to throw it out. In terms of testing is done on a voluntary basis right now. The DNR encourages hunters to do so. The testing facility is, in my opinion, undermanned and underfunded. They're working on making that better, but it's only on a voluntary basis. I think if we were going to take this seriously, I think the DNR would have to go back to some form of probably mandatory random testing so we could actually get a good handle on what's going on out there. I actually got into a conversation with a man named Dr. James Kroll, who refers to himself as Dr. Deer, and he's probably the leader of the CWD deniers. he posted something on Facebook last week. Actually, I was on my way home from Wyoming, talking about how the Wisconsin DNR can't make the determinations that they're making because they don't have the accurate sample sizes. So I just asked them simply, so are you in support of them having mandatory random testing? And he didn't answer me, and tried to kind of go around a few times. And I just kept asking him, like, are you in favor? Yes or no? He hasn't answered that. So I don't know what his answer is to that, but it seems to me if that's your argument, then we should have more testing.
So what do you do when you take a deer? Do you always sample, or do you always get it tested? Is that what?
I always get it tested. There's kiosks throughout the state, which are basically just they almost look like produce stands, to be honest with you. And you take basically the head of your deer and the first few inches of the neck, because they check the lymph nodes in the neck. And you take that, and there's plastic bags. You put it in a plastic bag with a card that has your name and license number and, county of kill and some other information. And you put it in there, and volunteers throughout the state pick them up and get them to the testing facility. And then you're able to go online a few weeks later and see what the, results are. So I do that. I butcher all our deer, package them up, mark them with, which one's which. But that's really what we're doing. I'm actually in the process of working on one down here, getting a dumpster here. I know they're all over the place, especially in the heavy CWD zones, kind of west of Madison. There'll be a bunch of them out there.
I'm kind of curious, I'm a casual follower of the chronic wasting disease story. I catch articles about it, for almost the last 20 years, and it doesn't seem like much has changed other than the problem has kind of grown and become more spread. And I guess as a casual observer, people who aren't necessarily hunters or don't have that strong connection, like how what are we missing? What do you think is not getting out or not being more widespread talked about in public circles?
I guess I'm going to ask you to clarify the question. What do non-hunters need to know about it, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I read the stories and I'm just wondering, why hasn't this been I don't know. It seems like 20 years of us talking about it, but not a lot of concern, or I don't know.
Well, I think part of it goes to the fact that it's kind of a slow moving issue. Right now, I think, at least from a scientific standpoint, we probably have too many deer in the state, and there's certainly areas of the state that do have too many deer. Talk about things that make you unpopular as a hunter, is saying something like that. But
I mean, is that the point? Is it basically, is hunting too political, that there's too many sides on this that are aren't listening to data? Or
hunting is too political. Like I said early on, there was a pushback from what people saw as just trying to kill off all the deer. So there's pushback from that, and now a lot of people just think that that's the case. And then there's a lot of, barroom politics going on, where you hear it's been out west for 40 years or 50 years, and they don't have any issues out there. And then when you say, yeah, but there's studies that are showing that their populations are declining out there, you just get met with blank stares. Or when you point out that all of those western states have CWD action plans that make ours pale in comparison, or our lack thereof kind of embarrassing, you get met with blank stares. People just don't understand that. And that's from the hunters. From the general public, I think it's important. You just got to remember, 6 million people in the state, and there was 600,000 deer licenses sold. Typically is the number that they, kind of figure at, maybe 10% of the state hunts. And, for me, just about everybody I hang out with hunts. And I think it might be a little bit different for you hanging out with, your group of friends. So then it just becomes just stuff that just doesn't pop up on your radar. Other than, there's zombie deer running around. It's not real splashy headlines coming out either. It's, it just is what it is. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
Yeah, and could you attach like a feeling to how you like what you're thinking about chronic wasting disease? Like, are you sad? Are you disappointed? Are you angry? Concerned? I mean, what are you feeling about it as a hunter right now?
um, well, I talked about that Pasowitz quote earlier at the beginning of this thing, and I just feel like we forget. And I think when you kind of study up on the history of hunting and the politics that go into it, it happens, and it happens. It's all cyclical, but we've forgotten what they've done. The people before us have done to make sure they got to us like this. But then once every couple generations, it'll cycle, and people will step up, and we've done that over and over again. So I have a lot of hope when it comes to that's going to happen again. But there's a lot of pushback against it. And then I think it's helpful to read about Aldo Leopold and stuff that he went through, and read about, a generation before, Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot and George Grinnell, and what they went through, and just kind of the political beatings that they took and how wrong they were, and what they were going to ruin hunting, and they didn't understand. And you see that they still were able to persevere and make the contributions that they did. It's very encouraging. And I think we're starting to see some of that. There's some big time success stories and big time heroes that are in the making right now that future generations are going to read about and probably know their names.
I know you said you're just in Madison talking about this issue. Recently, and the state DNR, recently announced a couple of big research projects, and have been trying to do some other things. I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts on, with a new administration in, are you feeling like they're taking it seriously? Where are we politically?
There was a lot of hope when Governor Evers took office, at least on the CWD standpoint. I think, well, Craig, you know me, I'm a pretty conservative guy. So I disagree with him on a lot of things, but there was some hope that there was going to be a change after basically 8 years of ignoring it in the Walker administration. That hope was dashed with the governor's budget, where he basically ignored CWD. And then the legislature, during their budgetary process, took $100,000 of hunters' money and gave it to the deer farm industry for them to study CWD. Basically, the way that the study read was, it was pretty much to study CWD to limit its impact on deer farms, which there was a lot of really, really, really angry people when that came out. We were fortunate that Governor Evers used a line item veto to take that out, where that funding didn't go to the deer farms and $100,000 stayed in hunters' pockets. But there's a lot of disappointment with what he did, or what his budget was, and his, I guess, inaction since he's taken office. There are some things going on through the legislature right now. I talked about the Adopt a Dumpster program that the DNR has. There's some bills that are going through that might make funding more readily accessible for that program. I think it's a stopgap, but it's something that's, I guess, at least happening. But politically, it's hard to get legislators to understand what exactly they're facing, when honestly the safest thing they can say, especially rural legislators, the safest thing they can say on the campaign trail is screw the DNR. And, that's the politically safe thing for them to say in a lot of districts, is screw the DNR. They don't know what they're talking about. They're going to get a lot of votes for that. That's the kind of the uphill battle that we're going through right now.
So I asked you a little bit ago about the worst case scenario. What in your mind is the best case scenario going forward on this?
The best case scenario going forward is that I'm wrong and CWD is not that big of a deal and it'll just go away. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that that's not a possibility. I don't believe it, just like I said, from reading the stuff that I've read. But my greatest hope is that I'm completely wrong on this thing, and it's not a big deal. I don't think that's true. So I'm not. So don't think we should just ignore it. But I hope that everybody who thinks I'm full of shit is right. That's the best case scenario.
You've recently been involved in with a group called the Back County Hunters and Anglers, and you're a member of their board of directors. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. What drew you to working with them specifically?
They seem to be the organization that kind of their idea of hunting lines up with my own, and they're doing stuff that I guess traditional organizations that are also great, Ducks Unlimited, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, other organizations like that are also great organizations and have proven track records. But BHA seems to be doing stuff that they're not, in terms of creating new hunters where new hunters didn't exist before, doing other things like that, kind of forward-thinking things that I think that's kind of what drew me to it, is just that. It's a young group. When you go to other conservation organizations, banquets and whatnot, most of the time I'd be one of the youngest people in the room. With BHA, I'm probably one of the older guys in the room at 36. There's a lot of energy with this organization that I like. So I guess that's really what drew me to them.
Is there a big difference between how young people see some of these issues and how some of the older generation sees some of these issues?
I don't know that I'd classify it as a generational thing. I think there's a difference. We have older people who are very interested in what BHA is doing now, mostly because they've been doing it on their own their whole lives. And there's certainly young people who think BHA isn't worth anything. So I don't know that the organization itself tends to be younger, but I don't know that it's just strictly a generational thing. I think it's more of a mindset thing.
So what kinds of issues is the organization tracking? And, especially it's kind of becoming a political election year. I mean, what kinds of issues are important to the organization?
Well, it's a public lands organization, kind of first and foremost, making sure that public lands stay in public hands. I guess that's our slogan, but that you have a place to hunt. In Wisconsin, we have quite a bit of public land compared to a lot of states. But it's out west, it's even more so. Like I said, I was in Wyoming last week. Pieces we were hunting it's 12 square miles of public land. And you just go hunt that for the day. And probably not hunt it all the way it should be with it being that big. So you're really making sure that continues and that people are able to continue to enjoy those lands. The other thing we've taken on is CWD. It's a national plank, I guess, in our platform. So we're dealing with stuff like that. In Wisconsin, there's a couple of things that are of interest. We have, in 2006, there was a bill passed that's kind of attached to a budget that nobody really noticed when it happened, but it makes it illegal to cross railroad tracks anywhere other than designated crossings. And thousands of acres of public land in Wisconsin basically got cut off or either became inaccessible or extremely difficult to access because of that. You think of the Mississippi River, for instance. The railroad tracks run basically the whole way up the shore of that river, and there's sloughs and ice fishing opportunities out there that have just been they're cut off. You can't get to them because the railroad track goes there without risking getting a trespassing ticket. So there's a movement. There's been a couple of movements previously to try to get that overturned. It's something that we're working on now. Again, just trying to get a bill passed that allows people to be able to access those properties. Not just out there. There's 121 properties that are owned by the DNR that are bisected by railroad tracks. We have some of the pieces I was talking about earlier where 10 minutes from my front door I can be out enjoying nature and hunting and doing whatever. There's railroad tracks going through some of those properties where if you were to shoot a pheasant or something and it landed on the other side of the railroad tracks, even though it's 15 feet away, legally, you need to walk a mile or better in order to pick up that bird. You got to go all the way back up to the road to cross the railroad tracks. So that's a big issue that we're dealing with. I talked about Governor Evers' budget. Another kind of disappointment was the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Fund. We were hoping that he would reauthorize that for 10 years. He reauthorized it for 2 years, which really kind of puts a damper on a lot of the projects that program supports. For, I guess, just to explain what that is, it's a fund that can be used to do just about everything, but is very, whether it's property acquisition or building in Waterford here where I'm from, we have a kayak slips along the Fox River down here, and those were all paid for with Knowles Nelson Stewardship Fund dollars. It's a very, very important program, very popular program that is in danger, and with the 2-year reauthorization, puts some of those projects at risk just because these projects, they might be multi-year projects where you don't want to start something that the funding might go away in 2 years. So that's something that we're going to continue to work on.
I think it's an interesting, the way that program has been seen or handled by politicians over the last 30 years is pretty interesting. Knowles Nelson, that's referring to two governors of different parties.
Right.
So it was a very bipartisan program, very, like you said, very popular. I think there's a lot of popular support among both sides of the aisle, but it's been something that's been kind of a political football. Got cut significantly under the Walker administration. I'm just kind of curious, like, why isn't there more support for a program like this, specifically by people in the state legislature? I just don't get it.
I think my understanding is there was key legislators that were against it, that were people of power, that they may have had the votes to make it for longer, but there was key people that were against it that just think, the DNR has too much land or they have too much power, and it goes back to bash the DNR and bash.
Just scoring points, I guess.
And scoring points, and just, and it goes back to, being a small government. I talked about lands out west. A small government is why would the federal government owns, the majority of land in some western states. How could that possibly be? And how terrible that is. And there's people who read the Constitution as saying that government can't own land. And I think they're misreading it. And the Supreme Court thinks they're misreading it, but that's the way they think. And there's politicians out there on the national level. They're actually just got reauthorized, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is kind of the national version of the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Fund. That fund, though, takes money from the royalties of offshore mineral extraction and uses it to. There's not a county in the United States that doesn't have a project that was funded by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And when you explain to people, we're taking some of this money that basically it's your money because they're offshore oil drilling that's our land and our property, and they have to pay royalties for it. And we're going to take a portion of that to support outdoor recreation. When you explain that to people, they're like, well, why wouldn't we do that? Who could possibly be against that? And then again, it was some key senators from the western states, Utah in particular, that were just against it. And so then it had trouble passing, and it actually lapsed for a while until just this last spring or last winter when it was finally reauthorized. It goes back to everything's political. Everything is, you want a smaller government. Well, how can you be for a small government and be for this? And then it's just, and then when you start digging into it, you start to realize that people have other interests in some of this stuff, which is frustrating.
So when we were talking about chronic wasting disease, and a lot of points, we could have just cut out chronic wasting disease and put in climate change as the thing we were talking about. It seems it seems to be kind of following a similar track. It's something we're all kind of aware of. There's a lot of research on it. There's a lot of distrust, conspiracy theories, all this kinds of thing. And I'm wondering how you feel about. Do you see like a parallel kind of thing going on between how people feel about, chronic wasting disease and how people feel about climate change, maybe on a more national and global level?
I do. I think there's a lot of finger pointing at both sets of scientists saying, they just want to make this into a big deal so they keep getting paid. And a lot of these guys, it's like they're career scientists that are for whatever program that, like the DNR has basically been, there hasn't been CWD funding for the last 10 years. So it's not like they're getting rich on anything. But the bigger problem is when you look at the scientists who are saying that it's not a big deal. I mentioned Dr. Kroll, and you look at where a lot of his funding comes from. It's from the deer farm, the captive cervid industry, who have a financial stake in CWD not being a big issue because there's a significant push for increased regulations on that industry, if not just the straight up shutting down that industry, and they're worried about that. So then it behooves them to make it not a big issue, and that's who's paying a lot of these guys. But when you point that out, it again just gets met with blank stares because it's easier to just say, "Oh, they're getting paid to say that," and they're just supporting themselves. And it's always, I guess, you have that issue, and then you also have the issue of it's kind of like saying a cancer researcher is just in it for himself. But we don't say that, so I don't understand why in this instance it is, other than they're saying something we don't like.
What did you make of the protests by young people recently across the country, calling on lawmakers to address climate change, to actually do something?
To be honest, only kind of peripherally followed that. The thing that I really thought, though, what's the Greta Thunberg?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Was the animosity towards her personally, instead of just attacking what she was saying, which I think there's room for, and certainly there needs to be room for it. All of this, like I said, is we need to use facts here. And I think having children do that goes to the emotional side of things. But I think the backlash against that was emotional as well. Instead of just saying, this is what she said, these are the facts she used, are these true or not? And we do too much of that on all levels in this country and world, instead of what's actually happening. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but these are scientific questions. It's either true or it's false. That's where it is. And the facts will either support it or they won't. Politicization, is that the right word? Of that,
yeah.
Of these issues bothers me, because let's just figure out what's going on. Is it actually happening? Great. Is it not happening? Great. This is what we're going to do. And we don't do enough to allow that type of debate anymore.
But I mean, just the research is out there, right? I mean, there's a lot of research that says something's happening. And, I think you can debate what should be done, but something should be done, shouldn't it?
When it comes to CWD or when it comes to climate change?
Climate change.
To be honest, Craig, I haven't followed it enough, but I think if the science is showing something's happening, then it's that's what should be done. Does that mean, everybody don't drive your car anymore ever? Or does it mean, hey, maybe let's just get a few less gallons or make cars a little bit more efficient? And that's up for debate. But if the science shows it's happening, then I think that's where we are, is what should be done, not whether or not something should happen.
But basically, you're frustrated. Like, I think everybody's frustrated that it becomes just political. It's a political conversation versus a scientific conversation, or a realistic, what can we get done kind of conversation.
Right. And then I have trouble with, like, most of the time, the things that are a lot of the, I guess, simple solutions that are suggested are, even if climate change isn't real, wouldn't the world be a little bit better if we did that? Whether or not you believe something is happening has more to do with which political party you belong to than it does, I guess, anything else. That's a problem. We need to be able to think about things without worrying about that. And we just, I say we're losing that. I don't know if we've ever had that. I mean, you look back through the history of this country, we've obviously had squabbles the whole way through. Some of them bigger than others. So I don't know. I think we like to paint this rosy picture of history that maybe isn't exactly true, but that would be helpful if we were able to, I guess, decide on the issue rather than which side of the issue your party is on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it just seems like there is such a huge opportunity for sportsmen, hunters, conservation people, and that are on the conservative side and environmentalists on the left side. It seems like they have so much in common, but it just gets derailed by like random things.
Right. And I think getting back, I guess, to BHA, that's one thing that this organization does is they've made some allies that have raised some eyebrows, I think raised some eyebrows throughout the hunting community. But then when you start to think about why they're making those allies, it's because we're both on the same side on this one issue. And I don't have to like you on the other issues, but on this one issue, let's go get them on it. And our country could learn a lot from that. And hopefully that's something that would continue, I guess, everywhere.
So overall, like, what path do you feel like we're on as a state in regards to conservation? Do you feel like we're going to figure it out? Are you concerned? I mean, what's kind of your analysis of what path we're on right now?
I'm concerned, but optimistic because we've been here before. Like I said, when you read about what the guys who came before us went through and the fights that they had, you realize that there's nothing new here. I mean, and we're fighting the same fights that they were. That the names have changed, but it's the same battles. And they were successful, which means that we could be successful. And there's a lot of hope because of that.
Always nice to catch up with my old college roommate. It was nice to talk. I'm sure we'll do it again in the future. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.